Episode 692. Book Talk begins at 11 minutes and 49 seconds. Cranford begins with episode 679. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 692, Graphically Jane. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by our lovely patrons, our YouTube channel members, and our craftlit.com/premium members. And this week, we would like to highlight Vicky S., Linda Shodwar, Inovikova, Phoebe Bixler, and Marcy Gessel. Thank you so much for your support. We could not do this without you. This month, July 2025, please don't forget that we are raffling off the book Botanical Knits, 12 Designs Inspired by Trees and Foliage by Anna Davos of Never Not Knitting. We have a link to her website, Never Not Knitting, in the show notes for this episode. But we also have some pictures from the book itself and the cover in the show notes as well. If you're watching on YouTube, you are watching a little video of some of the stuff that you're going to find in the book, and it is beautiful. So pretty. So that is our raffle item. And again, thank you, Susan, for sending those in to raffle off. I am drinking Plum Deluxe Gratitude Blend. And this is because today I am very grateful. Andrew and I this morning went out early. He's going to be gone for the next couple of days. So we took our work with us up to this cute little place called the Lumberville General Store that serves breakfast and lunch. And it's actually where we had my 50th birthday party and Aiden's bar mitzvah party. So it's a great old funky place. I think it goes back to the 1700s. But out of nowhere, one of my best friends from UCLA, who is still a friend, he lives in New York, he and his husband came by and texted and said, "Hey, we're in town." They asked, "Can we meet you for lunch?" Like maybe that little place where you had the party. And we were already there. That never happens. I am so grateful for that. Just that little bright jolt of happy. Definitely needed, definitely appreciated. So grateful. So I just wanted to share that, but also it's really good tea. This is the one that's black tea, orange peel, blue cornflowers, which doesn't sound like an important thing, but you can see like the blue cornflowers in the tea, and it's really pretty. Strawberries, you can taste them. Raspberry leaves, bergamot oil, you know I'm a sucker for bergamot, and strawberry essence, which again doesn't taste cloying, like ew, chemical flavor. It's not that. It's subtle and it's good. So there we are with our gratitude blend. And this week you will in fact learn why we've been talking so much about tea. We also are going to be able to release the video episode of my conversation with Andy Hayes. And if it makes sense to just listen without having to see anything on the screen, we'll also release it as a bonus podcast. If not, it may just live on YouTube, but I have to test that theory. I'm not entirely sure that it would work without the visuals. So it may pop up as a bonus on your regular podcast feed. If not, I'll let you know next week that it is just on YouTube. This week, the little crafty bit that I wanted to share with you is I am in the process of doing some knitting out of one of the Knit Nation newspapers. So next episode, I should have that finished and be able to give you my feedback on it and let you know what I think about their patterns and the books as or the newspapers as a whole. But the other thing that I wanted to share with you is this. This book is The Novel Life of Jane Austen, a graphic biography. Okay. So if you listen to Emma, you may remember that Janine Barchas was one of my favorite writers when it comes to stories about Jane Austen. She is the author on this book, and she did this with Isabel Greenberg because Isabel Greenberg is an illustrator. But this is a graphic biography. It is a graphic novel of Jane Austen's life. So you get these spreads where you've got regular Jane Austen life, which is all in shades of gray and yellow. But then you have these moments of bright pink color. Those are moments that are lifted from Jane Austen's books. So what you get out of this is this marvelous conversation between Jane Austen's real life and how that real life shows up in her books. And I went in and I read the story of when they went to Bath and went and visited the Gothic castles nearby. If you remember Northanger Abbey, you remember how they were like, hey, we can go see a Gothic castle. Why don't you come with me and blow off your other real friends? And she does, and she feels horrible about it, especially because A, they never got there in the first place, and B, she would have been really disappointed if they did because it was a folly, meaning it was like a set. It was set decoration. It was somebody built something that looked castle-ish, but was made out of modern materials and had no history to it. So Jane Austen got to go to that location, but she did also get to go far enough out that she was able to see a real Gothic castle while she was there that was built in the 1400s. And that's what's in, that's just one of the episodes that is going on in this book. It is marvelous fun. I'm so impressed and I'm so excited. I love getting to see that conversation happen between Jane Austen's real life and Jane Austen's art. And it's just beautiful. It's a gift. And I mean, it's a graphic novel. It's like, and the art style is very comfortable. Like you will feel like you could have sketched the illustrations, but part of her genius is how she puts the pieces together. Because it's very hard to, in a book like this, get the right information visually in the frame in order to help it make the words make sense. And it's really great. Isabel Greenberg did a fantastic job, I think. And the color coding is super helpful because you can flip pages real fast and find the moments of book text or book action mirrors that episode in Jane Austen's life. You can find that stuff really easily because of the bright, bright pink. So I'm just so excited. So we will have a link out to the bookshop.org page for this book. And yeah, what a treat. If you watched the Emma live stream, and you may recall that the author of this book was one of Becca's professors. So I'm so thrilled. So very exciting news. Always fun to see new stuff. Always fun to see new research presented, especially in such a unique way on Jane Austen, because it's nice to read about a time when life was easier. I mean, it wasn't, but it was. Then right now, it's kind of nice. So last week, the chapter 13, was very sad, and it ended with that so sad scene of Miss Matty crying and really worrying about Martha, which was just so sweet and heartbreaking and just a wonderful Miss Matty moment. But at the end of the episode, we played you out with some voicemails, and Becky, who called in, brought up I had made the comment about when Mary Smith is sitting on the floor next to the fireplace. It's the first time that I remember somebody sitting on the floor in one of those dresses. And she's right. Jo March from Little Women, it is the first line of the book. I was my limited brain truly bisected human people at that point into adults and children. And when she reminded me about the Joe March thing, I thought, yeah, honestly, I am not surprised that my brain didn't remember that at the time. 3 years ago, I would have remembered it, and I don't now. So yeah, boy, my brain just did not want to define that opportunity of floor sitting to be anything other than an adult woman doing it. I don't know why. Brains are weird. Okay, so for chapter 14 today, there's going to be a mention of a rubric. Now, if you're a teacher in today's teaching world, you are probably very familiar with rubrics being used to assess student work. And a well crafted rubric can be spectacularly useful. A bad rubric can be really awful, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this. The Book of Common Prayer for the Church of England actually had printed in it at one point. I don't actually know if this is still true. I don't have one on hand to look at, but it had directions for holding a service, and those directions were printed in red, kind of like there are red word Bibles that have everything Jesus says in red, so it's really easy to flip through the Gospels and find the Beatitudes because it's easy to see. When you hear the word rubric today, it really is kind of a reference to the Book of Common Prayer thing because, and I did not know this, the Latin word for red is rubere or rubra, rubric. So it started off as red text, and then it became rules, a rule, just a general thing. And there it is. There are some surprising word definitions in more places in this chapter. We will go there and see right now. There is some surprisingly poetic text about mailing a letter to a faraway place that I found beautiful. It's early on in the chapter, and it's just a lovely piece of writing from Mrs. Gaskell. You're going to hear about a housekeeper, a house servant, she struck for wages. She went on strike for higher pay. There's a reference to Mammon. Man cannot serve both God and Mammon. Matthew 6:24. The annotation in the copy of Cranford that I'm using said that Mammon was the god of greed, or the god of wealth, or the god of money. And I looked at Andrew and said, "That's not right, is it?" And so Andrew and I did some digging, and it's right-ish. Here's the deal. Around the Middle Ages, Mammon started being translated as a demon. Sometimes not, the devil is not even the right word, but it starts being associated with some sort of personification in the medieval period. Why? Because the medieval period is also where you had the mystery plays that were going on. And I've talked about these lots of times on CraftLit, that people had the actors' troupe would have little wagons. They bring the wagons into town, set them up, and people walk wagon to watch different scenes. They were almost always religious in nature. And in those, they were personifying attributes. So you would have every man, capital E. You would have strength, capital S. So somebody is playing strength. Someone's acting strength. You had greed, capital G. Somebody acting the part of a greedy person, greed personified. And every man, of course, is the stand-in for all of us. So at some point, the Mammon thing became associated with greed from that. And Milton uses Mammon like a demon of greed or covetousness or something. There are some sites that say that in Hebrew it means money, but in modern Hebrew it means wealth, which seemed strange because this word is not in the Torah. I think it doesn't show up in the Bible until the New Testament. So I don't know. It was all over the place. If you understand it as you cannot serve God and mammon, meaning wealth, going along with the it is harder for a rich man, it is harder for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. This is that same thing. You can't serve two masters. If your real religion is getting rich, that's going to be a problem. So yeah, the annotation was not really right. However, it does appear that there was a Syrian god of wealth, like in Syria. And maybe that's what she's referring to. I don't know. Akimbo. When you put your arms akimbo, I thought, I need to go to the OED and see what the OED has to say. And I'm glad I did, because akimbo doesn't have an agreed upon, or it didn't when my OED is from 1972. There is no agreed upon source for this word, period. So you've got lots of forms. Kenbo, Kenebowe, Kenbo, Kenbow, Kenball, Kenbol. It just goes on. There's so many different versions. And some people think that it goes back to an Icelandic word, which is kengbogin, which means crooked, literally bent staple-wise, like an archway or a horseshoe shape. But then there's also another medieval source that they're like, well, maybe it's Cambach, and maybe not. The thing that's interesting, though, is this note. The difficulty as to a Cambach or a Cambo is that no forms of the word show cam, C-A-M, from which the earliest are the most remote. The Icelandic, Koingbagen, comes nearer the form, but there is no evidence that it had the special sense of akimbo, which I will get to in a moment, and none that the latter ever had the general sense of crooked. It also postulates an early English series of forms like kengbo, kenbaud, kenbao, a kingbao, and all of those sources are unknown, unaccounted for in writing. However, this is the actual definition according to the OED of the arms in a position in which the hands rest on the hips and the elbows are turned outward. And how old is the oldest known written use of that word? 1400. So it's its origin is lost in the mists of time. But I mean, even if you know what Kimbo meant, I bet you didn't know that it didn't have a source. So, yay! New funky weird stuff. You know I'm always up for that. Oh, there's a lovely, lovely section of dialogue with Martha that I just adore. So you get the really nice male thing followed hard on by Martha just being marvelous, and it's lovely. There is a reference to a song, AAah Voo DEER-ray, Mammon, which is French, if I said it right, for "Oh, tell me, mama," which, according to the annotations, is French, I hope I said it right, for "Shall I tell you, mama?" You can let me know if that is correct in its translation. Like, I'm not entirely confident the annotations are all correct in here, so yeah, let me know. But basically, when you hear the reference to this song, all you need to know is that the song goes like this. Da, 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 da. Right? Twinkle Twinkle Little Star is how I heard that song. It is the song that a child who is newly learning piano is going to be given. And if you never progress past that, you really didn't take piano lessons, or you really had no facility for doing piano. And Mozart evidently did like 12 variations of the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star motif. Good for him. I thought about going to find them, and then I thought, no. Personally, I'm partial to Tom Lair's Clementine, where he does riffs on the song Clementine. I'm linking that out because I just adore Tom Lair. But yeah, that's all it is. Super, super easy song to play. There's a moment where you're going to hear a description of somebody basically using a window pane as a light box and tracing out patterns nicely for muslin embroidery by putting a piece of silver paper over the design to be copied and holding both against the window pane and marking the scallop and eyelet holes. So I checked with Leanne, our lace expert, about this because, as you know, I'm not entirely trusting the annotations in the book that I have. They said it's a thing called broderie anglaise, and I have in the show notes pictures to show you what this actually looks like. And yes, it does have scalloped edges and cut work. So there's an embroidery stitch, and then there's the cut work of the eyelets where you basically make a buttonhole, very dense buttonhole, and then cut out the center circle. And I mean, you've probably seen eyelets before in little girls' dresses. Either way, the important thing to know is being able to trace out a scalloped edge and circles for eyelets is not the most complex of tasks. Honestly, the hardest part would be holding the paper and the pattern against the window in a world without Scotch tape. So, yeah, super easy song, super easy task. Then there's a reference to the use of globes, plural, in ladies' seminary. Now, we've heard ladies' seminary before. It's like a finishing school. It's not a really rigorous kind of education for women. But I wondered why globes plural. That seemed odd to me. And it turns out that there were terrestrial globes used to learn geography, where you see the world on a globe's surface with latitude lines and longitude lines. And that's how that information is being taught. But there were also celestial globes that were used for really simple astronomy, learning constellations. So you'd be able to, by where the constellations were placed on this globe, you'd be able to see, like, okay, on this date in the Northern Hemisphere, I should be able to see the belt of Orion or the Orion constellation or Cassiopeia. You would be able to see that if you were in the Northern Hemisphere, these are the constellations you'll be able to see at this time of year. And then if you are on the Southern Hemisphere at the same time, you'd be able to see these constellations, and you could plot it out. There are lines on there to show which part of the sky you would be able to see during which part of the year, which I thought was kind of cool that they're learning it that way. Honestly, I wish we'd learned it that way in 8th grade. It's really cool. There is a reference to wool work and counting threads. So the wool work that they're talking about is probably Berlin work. And if you think about needlepoint, modern day needlepoint, like where you get a painted canvas and you use fairly sturdy, thick wool yarn to stitch, it's like paint by numbers, but with yarn, because the picture is painted on the muslin or on the canvas. If you think about that, or petty point, actually petty point is probably a better thing to think of, because on petty point canvas, I believe there are large holes and smaller holes slightly off center, and it means that you can do super tiny stitches or regular size stitches no matter where you are on the pattern. That's now. Back during this time, it would be done on muslin or a lightweight canvas, and you would have to count the threads yourself to know at which point you put the needle up and which point you put it down. You would be counting those threads, and the design would not be painted necessarily on the canvas itself. They certainly could have. They had the technology, they had the power. These patterns showed up in places like Mrs. Beaton's Book of Needlework. And I actually have a link out to a Gutenberg.org page for that book of Mrs. Beeton's Book of Needlework. So one of the things that they're going to mention as well is portraits of royalty, specifically, I think it's Queen Adelaide they mentioned by name. Around 1830 or earlier, it was very popular to stitch portraits of royalty in this technique, this Berlin work technique. By the time of Cranford, you know what I'm about to say, it was no longer popular. So again, they're always like 10 years out of date, and everybody who read this book at the time would have known that, and now you do too. There's going to be a mention of having trouble getting through a genealogical chapter. This is a reference to those chapters in the Bible that are all the begats. It's hard to read through all the begats and make them feel like they all matter. And I agree. A reference to under a glass shade. This would be like if you have a really pretty objet d'art in the home and you, living in early Victorian times, did not want it to get very, very dusty, which would have been so easy because dust, yikes, you would get these little glass shades, or sometimes they're called cloches because they look like a woman's cloche hat, like a glass bell that you could put over something to protect it. You can also use these in gardening for heat retention. So if you're trying to get plants to grow a little early in the season, you can keep them a little bit more protected from the weather by having these glass bell jars that you put over them, except it's expensive, as you would imagine. Couchant, we've come across this before. In heraldry, couchant is any animal lying down. So in the show notes, we've got a picture of a lion couchant, and you'll see he's got his head up, but his feet are definitely on the ground. The middle of his body is on the ground. He's got his tail curled around him. He is, as relaxed as you're going to see a lion in heraldry. In the example I've got, he's also sticking his tongue out. So I don't know what that has to say about how he feels about the family that he's attached to. I don't know. The East India Tea Company, we have talked about them before, but because tea is actually important in this chapter, the East India Tea Company was founded in 1600, and Queen Elizabeth I gave it the royal charter, and it held that charter, which was the right to trade with India and China and import their tea. They had that charter as a monopoly until 1834. So nobody else could go to China or go to India and purchase tea and import it themselves. Everybody had to be signed on to the East India Company. Everybody got their tea through the East India Company. And I thought, well, that's really weird because I remember that the Twinings started a way long time ago. They started a shop, I think in 1707. They started a shop in London. It's still there. It's at 216 Strand. They started this little tea shop, and by 1717, that had turned into not just a shop, but a tea room where ladies could go and sit and have tea. While the men are at the pub, the women would be here in the tea room. Twinings had to buy the building next door to them at some point because they needed the overflow space because it was so popular. So they were buying tea from the East India Company and then repackaging it, but also doing their own flavor blends. It started that way. It's continued that way. And that's what threw me off. I kept thinking, well, Twinings started so early. How did they do it if the East India Company has a monopoly? They only had a monopoly on the import of tea, not the selling of it. So you'd still wind up, obviously, they made a lot of money because it was a monopoly and it was very popular. And I also found out that the logo that they created for Twinings, which is still there, it's 1787, that is the world's oldest logo in continuous use. Who knew? You're going to hear a line where a girl is talking to a guy about how just yesterday you were talking about annexing me, and it is spelled that way. AN-AXING, annexing me. This is annexing me, Like if you create an annex, you're pulling something off the main and keeping it to yourself. You are annexing the land. You are annexing part of a room. Annexing a person would be like getting married, taking them off the market. I thought that was such a cute way of saying it. We have another weird one here today. Our mites. You may remember the phrase a widow's mite because of Mark 12:43 in the Bible. Boy, is there a lot of conversation about what a mite means. In the OED, the definitions definitely go back to farthings, that this is a sub, like way below the amount of a penny, super tiny change. And they were super tiny, like in America, the dimes are small. However, I think this is a problem because my OED is so old. Because according to research that seems to be much more recent, in biblical times, a mite was the lowest denomination of coin in Judea. So 2 mites equal 1 lepta. And lepta meant thin or small in Greek. 2 mites was the equivalent of a quadran, which was the smallest Roman coin. So in the Bible, when Jesus praises the widow who gives her last 2 mites for the temple, it's she had nothing and she gave all that she had, just 2 mites, and that was everything for her. So you know what a sacrifice this must be. Jesus praises her for doing that because the other people who have a lot more money are coming in and doing their, 10% if you're lucky. And here's this woman who's giving her all, and these people who are never going to feel the pain of what they just gave to the temple. So that's the actual definition of mites. I think it's important to know just how small a thing we're talking about when people are talking about sharing their mites, mites. There's going to be a reference to how we behave, how we act in the world is being tracked by another account book, like all capital letters, and that would be God taking account of how we are behaving, keeping a list and checking it twice. Spills. I could not remember in an earlier chapter the word. Amy called in and told me quilling. Quilling is the process by which you super, super tightly wind paper in order to make different shapes. You can also make just long, thin shapes, and they become really useful as candle lighters if they're twisted tightly enough. There is a skill set here. It sounds so simple. And I actually found a link out to how to make quilled spills. And a comfit. I know we've come across this before, but now I have something more useful. It's when you took a nut or a seed or a little dried berry, a raisin or something, and then you cover it in a sugar coating that makes it crunchy on the outside, and then you've got the little tiny treat on the inside. Max Miller of Tasting History made sugar plums, and the process is exactly the same. So that was a fun video, and I believe his result at the end was, "Oh, that tastes good. It tastes like sweetness. Is it worth making? No." And he was very clear. He's like, "I'm glad I did it. I'm glad you can see it. There is no need for you to do it yourself at home. It was a pain." And it really is. Watching him do it, if you had the equipment set up special for you to do it all the time, that would be great. But if not, what a pain in the tuchus it is. All right. That is everything. I did not expect this chapter to have so many words that I was like, no, actually, there is something else going on here. So it's a lovely chapter. You might want to get some tissues out. Maybe. Depends on the mood you're in. But let's listen to chapter 14 of Cranford, read for us by Noel Badrian. And if you are not listening to Noel Badrian read, please fast wind to 1 hour and 21 minutes. All right, here we go.
Chapter 14 of Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Noel Badrian. Friends in Need. It was an example to me, and I fancy it might be to many others, to see how immediately Miss Matty set about the retrenchment which she knew to be right under her altered circumstances. While she went down to speak to Martha and break the intelligence to her, I stole out with my letter to the AAah Jenkins and went to the signor's lodgings to obtain the exact address. I bound the signora to secrecy, and indeed her military manners had a degree of shortness and reserve in them which made her always say as little as possible, except when under the pressure of strong excitement. Moreover, which made my secret doubly sure, the signor was so far recovered as to be looking forward to travelling and conjuring again in the space of a few days, when he, his wife, and little Phoebe would leave Cranford. Indeed, I found him looking over a great black and red placard, in which the Signor Brunoni's accomplishments were set forth, and to which only the name of the town where he would next display them was wanting. He and his wife were so much absorbed in deciding where the red letters would come in with most effect, it might have been the rubric for that matter, that it was some time before I could get my question asked privately, and not before I had given several decisions, the wisdom of which I questioned afterwards with equal sincerity, as soon as the signor threw in his doubts and reasons on the important subject. At last I got the address, spelt by sound, and very queer it looked. I dropped it in the post on my way home, and then, for a minute, I stood looking at the wooden pane with a gaping slit which divided me from the letter but a moment ago in my hand. It was gone from me like life, never to be recalled. It would get tossed about on the sea and stained with sea waves, perhaps, and be carried among palm trees and scented with all tropical fragrance. The little piece of paper, but an hour ago so familiar and commonplace, had set out on its race to the strange wild countries beyond the Ganges. But I could not afford to lose much time on this speculation. I hastened home that Miss Matty might not miss me. Martha opened the door to me, her face swollen with crying. As soon as she saw me she burst out afresh, and taking hold of my arm she pulled me in and banged the door to, in order to ask me if indeed it was all true that Miss Matty had been saying. "I'll never leave her. No, I won't. I telled her so, and said I could not think how she could find in her heart to give me warning. I could not have had the face to do it if I'd been her. I might have been just as good for nothing as Mrs. Fitzadam's Rosie, who struck for wages after living 7 years and a half in one place. I said I was not one to go and serve Mammon at that rate, that I knew when I'd got a good mistress, if she didn't know when she'd got a good servant." "But Martha," said I, cutting in while she wiped her eyes. "Don't but Martha me," she replied to my deprecatory tone. "Listen to reason." "I'll not listen to reason," she said, now in full possession of her voice, which had been rather choked with sobbing. "Reason always means what someone else has got to say. Now, I think what I've got to say is good enough reason. But reason or not, I'll say it, and I'll stick to it. I've money in the savings bank, and I've a good stock of clothes, and I'm not going to leave Miss Matty. No, not if she gives me warning every hour in the day." She put her arms akimbo, as much as to say she defied me, and, indeed, I could hardly tell how to begin to remonstrate with her, so much did I feel that Miss Matty, in her increasing infirmity, needed the attendance of this kind and faithful woman. "Well," said I at last, "I'm thankful you begin with well. If you'd ha' begun with but, as you did afore, I'd not ha' listened to you. Now you may go on." "I know you would be a great loss to Miss Matty, Martha." "I telled her so. A loss she'd never cease to be sorry for, broke in Martha triumphantly. Still, she will have so little, so very little, to live upon, that I don't see just now how she could find your food. She will even be pressed for her own. I tell you this, Martha, because I feel you are like a friend to dear Miss Matty, but you know she might not like to have it spoken about." Apparently this was even a blacker view of the subject than Miss Matty had presented to her, for Martha just sat down on the first chair that came to hand and cried out loud. We had been standing in the kitchen. At last she put her apron down, and looking me earnestly in the face, asked, "Was that the reason Miss Matty wouldn't order a pudding today? She said she had no great fancy for sweet things, and you and she would just have a mutton chop. But I'll be up to her, never you tell, but I'll make her a pudding, and a pudding she'll like too, and I'll pay for it myself, so mind you see she eats it. Many a one has been comforted in their sorrow by seeing a good dish come upon the table." I was rather glad that Martha's energy had taken the immediate and practical direction of pudding making, for it staved off the quarrelsome discussion as to whether she should or should not leave Miss Matty's service. She began to tie on a clean apron and otherwise prepare herself for going to the shop for the butter, eggs, and what else she might require. She would not use a scrap of the articles already in the house for her cookery, but went to an old teapot in which her private store of money was deposited, and took out what she wanted. I found Miss Matty very quiet and not a little sad. But by and by she tried to smile for my sake. It was settled that I was to write to my father and ask him to come over and hold a consultation. And as soon as this letter was dispatched, we began to talk over future plans. Miss Matty's idea was to take a single room, and retain as much of her furniture as would be necessary to fit up this, and sell the rest, and there to quietly exist upon what would remain after paying the rent. For my part, I was more ambitious and less contented. I thought of all the things by which a woman past middle age, and with the education common to ladies 50 years ago, could earn or add to a living without materially losing caste. But at length I put even this last clause on one side, and wondered what in the world Miss Matty could do. Teaching was, of course, the first thing that suggested itself. If Miss Matty could teach children anything, it would throw her among the little elves in whom her soul delighted. I ran over her accomplishments. Once upon a time I heard her say she could play AAah Voo DEER-ray, Mamma, on the piano, but that was long, long ago. That faint shadow of musical acquirement had died out years before. She had also once been able to trace out patterns very nicely for muslin embroidery, by dint of placing a piece of silver paper over the design to be copied, and holding both against the window-pane while she marked the scallop and eyelet holes. But that was her nearest approach to the accomplishment of drawing, and I did not think it would go very far. Then again, as to the branches of a solid English education, fancy work and the use of the globes, such as the mistresses of the ladies' seminary, to which all the tradespeople in Cranford sent their daughters, professed to teach. Miss Matty's eyes were failing her, and I doubted if she could discover the number of threads in a worsted work pattern, or rightly appreciate the different shades required for Queen Adelaide's face in the loyal wool work now fashionable in Cranford. As for the use of the globes, I had never been able to find it out myself, so perhaps I was not a good judge of Miss Matty's capability of instructing in this branch of education, but it struck me that equators and tropics and such mystical circles were very imaginary lines indeed to her, and that she looked upon the signs of the zodiac as so many remnants of the black art. What she piqued herself upon as arts in which she excelled was making candle-lighters or spills, as she preferred calling them, of coloured paper cut so as to resemble feathers, and knitting garters in a variety of dainty stitches. I had once said, on receiving a present of an elaborate pair, that I should feel quite tempted to drop one of them in the street in order to have it admired, but I found this little joke, and it was a very little one, was such a distress to her sense of propriety, and was taken with such anxious earnest alarm, lest the temptation might some day prove too strong for me, that I quite regretted having ventured upon it. A present of these delicately wrought garters, a bunch of gay spills, or a set of cards on which sewing silk was wound in a mystical manner, were the well-known tokens of Miss Matty's favour. But would anyone pay to have their children taught these arts? Or, indeed, would Miss Matty sell for filthy lucre the knack and the skill with which she made trifles of value to those who loved her? I had come down to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and, in reading the chapter every morning, she always coughed before coming to long words. I doubted her power of getting through a genealogical chapter with any number of coughs. Writing she did well and delicately, but spelling. She seemed to think that the more out of the way this was, and the more trouble it cost her, the greater the compliment she paid to her correspondent. And words she would spell quite correctly in her letters to me became perfect enigmas when she wrote to my father. No, there was nothing she could teach to the rising generation of Cranford, unless they had been quick learners and ready imitators of her patience, her humility, her sweetness, her quiet contentment with all that she could not do. I pondered and pondered until dinner was announced by Martha, with a face all blubbered and swollen with crying. Miss Matty had a few little peculiarities which Martha was apt to regard as whims below her attention, and appeared to consider as childish fancies of which an old lady of 58 should try and cure herself. But to-day everything was attended to with the most careful regard. The bread was cut to the imaginary pattern of excellence that existed in Miss Matty's mind, as being the way which her mother had preferred. The curtain was drawn so as to exclude the dead brick wall of a neighbour's stables, and yet left so as to show every tender leaf of the poplar which was bursting into spring beauty. Martha's tone to Miss Matty was just such as that good, rough-spoken servant usually kept sacred for little children, and which I had never heard her use to any grown-up person. I had forgotten to tell Miss Matty about the pudding, and I was afraid she might not do justice to it, for she had evidently very little appetite this day, so I seized the opportunity of letting her into the secret, while Martha took away the meat. Miss Matty's eyes filled with tears, and she could not speak, either to express surprise or delight, when Martha returned bearing it aloft, made in the most wonderful representation of a lion couchant that ever was moulded. Martha's face gleamed with triumph as she set it down before Miss Matty, with an exultant "There!" Miss Matty wanted to speak her thanks, but could not, so she took Martha's hand and shook it warmly, which set Martha off crying, and I myself could hardly keep up the necessary composure. Martha burst out of the room, and Miss Matty had to clear her voice once or twice before she could speak. At last she said, "I should like to keep this pudding under a glass shade, my dear," and the notion of the lion couchant with its currant eyes being hoisted up to the place of honour on the mantelpiece tickled my hysterical fancy, and I began to laugh, which rather surprised Miss Matty. "I am sure, dear, I have seen uglier things under a glass shade before now," said she. So had I, many a time and oft, and I accordingly composed my countenance, and now I could hardly keep from crying. and we both fell to upon the pudding, which was indeed excellent, only every morsel seemed to choke us, our hearts were so full. We had too much to think about to talk much that afternoon. It passed over very tranquilly. But when the tea-urn was brought in, a new thought came into my head. Why should not Miss Matty sell tea? Be an agent to the East India Tea Company, which then existed. I could see no objections to this plan, while the advantages were many, always supposing that Miss Matty could get over the degradation of condescending to anything like trade. Tea was neither greasy nor sticky, grease and stickiness being two of the qualities which Miss Matty could not endure. No shop window would be required. A small, genteel notification of her being licensed to sell tea would, it is true, be necessary, but I hoped that it could be placed where no one would see it. Neither was tea a heavy article, so as to tax Miss Matty's fragile strength. The only thing against my plan was the buying and selling involved. While I was giving but absent answers to the questions Miss Matty was putting, almost as absently, we heard a clumping sound on the stairs and a whispering outside the door, which indeed once opened and shut as if by some invisible agency. After a little while Martha came in, dragging after her a great tall young man, all crimson with shyness, and finding his only relief in perpetually sleeking down his hair. "Please, ma'am, he's only Jem Hearn," said Martha by way of an introduction. And so out of breath was she that I imagine she had had some bodily struggle before she could overcome his reluctance to be presented on the courtly scene of Miss Matilda Jenkins's drawing-room. "And please, ma'am, he wants to marry me offhand. And please, ma'am, we want to take a lodger, just one quiet lodger, to make our two ends meet. And we'd take any house conformable. And, oh dear Miss Matty, if I may be so bold, would you have any objection to lodging with us? Jem wants it as much as I do." To Jem, "You great oaf, why can't you back me?" "But he does want it all the same, very bad. Don't you, Jem? Only, you see, he's dazed at being called on to speak before quality." "It's not that," broke in Jem. "It's that you've taken me all on a sudden, and I didn't think for to get married so soon, and such quick work does flabbergast a man. It's not that I'm against it, ma'am," addressing Miss Matty, "only Martha has such quick ways with her when once she takes a thing into her head. And marriage, ma'am, marriage nails a man, as one may say. I dare say I shan't mind it after it's once over." "Please, ma'am," said Martha, who had plucked at his sleeve and nudged him with her elbow, and otherwise tried to interrupt him all the time he had been speaking. "Don't mind him, he'll come to. 'Twas only last night he was an-axing me, and all the more because I said I could not think of it for years to come. And now he's only taken aback with the suddenness of the joy. But you know, Jem, you are just as full as me about wanting a lodger." Another great nudge. "Aye, if Miss Matty would lodge with us. Otherwise I've no mind to be cumbered with strange folk in the house," said Jem, with a want of tact which I could see enraged Martha, who was trying to represent a lodger as the great object which they wished to obtain, and that, in fact, Miss Matty would be smoothing their path and conferring a favour if she would only come and live with them. Miss Matty herself was bewildered by the pair. Their, or rather Martha's, sudden resolution in favour of matrimony staggered her and stood between her and the contemplation of the plan which Martha had at heart. Miss Matty began. "Marriage is a very solemn thing, Martha." "It is indeed, ma'am," quoth Jem. "Not that I've no objections to Martha." "You've never let me a be for asking me for to fix when I would be married," said Martha, her face all afire and ready to cry with vexation, "and now you're shaming me before my missus and all." "Nay now, Martha, don't he, don't he? Only a man likes to have breathing time," said Jem, trying to possess himself of her hand, but in vain. Then, seeing that she was more seriously hurt than he had imagined, he seemed to try to rally his scattered faculties, and with more straightforward dignity than, 10 minutes before, I should have thought it possible for him to assume, he turned to Miss Matty and said, "I hope, ma'am, you know that I am bound to respect everyone who has been kind to Martha. I always looked on her as to be my wife, sometime, and she has often and often spoken of you as the kindest lady that ever was, and though the plain truth is I would not like to be troubled with lodgers of the common run, yet if, ma'am, you'd honour us by living with us, I'm sure Martha would do her best to make you comfortable, and I'd keep out of your way as much as I could, which I reckon would be the best kindness such an awkward chap as me could do." Miss Matty had been very busy with taking off her spectacles, wiping them and replacing them, but all she could say was, "Don't let any thought of me hurry you into marriage, pray don't. Marriage is such a very solemn thing." "But Miss Matilda will think of your plan, Martha," said I, struck with the advantages that it offered, and unwilling to lose the opportunity of considering about it. "And I'm sure neither she nor I can ever forget your kindness, nor yours either, Jem." "Why, yes, ma'am, I'm sure I mean kindly, though I'm a bit fluttered by being pushed straight ahead into matrimony, as it were, and mayn't express myself conformable. But I'm sure I'm willing enough, and give me time to get accustomed." "So, Martha, wench, what's the use of crying so and slapping me if I come near?" This last was sotto voce, and had the effect of making Martha bounce out of the room, to be followed and soothed by her lover. Whereupon Miss Matty sat down and cried very heartily, and accounted for it by saying that the thought of Martha being married so soon gave her quite a shock, and that she should never forgive herself if she thought she was hurrying the poor creature. I think my pity was more for Jem of the two, but both Miss Matty and I appreciated to the full the kindness of the honest couple, although we said little about this, and a good deal about the chances and dangers of matrimony. The next morning, very early, I received a note from Miss Pole, so mysteriously wrapped up, and with so many seals on it to secure secrecy, that I had to tear the paper before I could unfold it. And when I came to the writing, I could hardly understand the meaning, it was so involved and oracular. I made out, however, that I was to go to Miss Pole at 11 o'clock, the number 11 being written in full length as well as in numerals, and A.M. twice dashed under, as if I were very likely to come at 11 at night, when all Cranford was usually abed and asleep by 10. There was no signature except Miss Pole's initials reversed, P.E. But as Martha had given me the note, with Miss Pole's kind regards, it needed no wizard to find out who sent it, and if the writer's name was to be kept secret, it was very well that I was alone when Martha delivered it. I went, as requested, to Miss Pole's. The door was opened to me by her little maid Lizzie, in Sunday trim, as if some grand event was impending over this work-day, and the drawing-room upstairs was arranged in accordance with this idea. The table was set out with the best green card-cloth and writing materials upon it. On the little chiffonier was a tray with a newly decanted bottle of cowslip wine and some ladies' finger biscuits. Miss Pole herself was in solemn array, as if to receive visitors, although it was only 11 o'clock. Mrs. Forrester was there, crying quietly and sadly, and my arrival seemed only to call forth fresh tears. Before we had finished our greetings, performed with lugubrious mystery of demeanour, there was another rat-tat-tat, and Mrs. Fitzadam appeared, crimson with walking and excitement. It seemed as if this was all the company expected, for now Miss Pole made several demonstrations of being about to open the business of the meeting by stirring the fire, opening and shutting the door, and coughing and blowing her nose. Then she arranged us all round the table, taking care to place me opposite to her. And last of all she inquired of me if the sad report was true, as she feared it was, that Miss Matty had lost all her fortune. Of course I had but one answer to make, and I never saw more unaffected sorrow depicted on any countenances than I did there on the three before me. "I wish Mrs. Jameson was here," said Mrs. Forrester at last, but to judge from Mrs. Fitzadam's face, she could not second the wish. "But without Mrs. Jameson," said Miss Pole, with just a sound of offended merit in her voice, "we, the ladies of Cranford, in my drawing-room assembled, can resolve upon something. I imagine we are none of us what may be called rich, though we all possess a genteel competency, sufficient for tastes that are elegant and refined, and would not, if they could, be vulgarly ostentatious." Here I observed Miss Pole refer to a small card concealed in her hand, on which I imagined she had put down a few notes. "Miss Smith," she continued, addressing me, familiarly known as Mary to all the company assembled, but this was a state occasion, "I have conversed in private, I made it my business to do so yesterday afternoon, with these ladies on the misfortune which has happened to our friend, and one and all of us have agreed that while we have a superfluity, it is not only a duty but a pleasure, a true pleasure, Mary." Her voice was rather choked just here, and she had to wipe her spectacles before she could go on, "to give what we can to assist her. Miss Matilda Jenkins. Only in consideration of the feelings of delicate independence existing in the mind of every refined female," I was sure she had got back to the card now, "we wish to contribute our mites in a secret and concealed manner, so as not to hurt the feelings I have referred to. And our object in requesting you to meet us this morning is that, believing you are the daughter, that your father is, in fact, her confidential adviser in all pecuniary matters, we imagined that, by consulting with him, you might devise some mode in which our contribution could be made to appear the legal due which Miss Matilda Jenkins ought to receive from—" Probably your father, knowing her investments, can fill up the blank. Miss Pole concluded her address, and looked round for approval and agreement. "I have expressed your meanings, ladies, have I not? And while Miss Smith considers what reply to make, allow me to offer you some little refreshment." I had no great reply to make. I had more thankfulness at my heart for their kind thoughts than I cared to put into words, and so I only mumbled out something to the effect that I would name what Miss Pole had said to my father, and that if anything could be arranged for dear Miss Matty, and here I broke down utterly, and had to be refreshed with a glass of cowslip wine before I could check the crying which had been repressed for the last 2 or 3 days. The worst was, all the ladies cried in concert. Even Miss Pole cried, who had said 100 times that to betray emotion before anyone was a sign of weakness and want of self-control. She recovered herself into a slight degree of impatient anger, directed against me as having set them all off, and, moreover, I think she was vexed that I could not make a speech back in return for hers, and if I had known beforehand what was to be said, and had a card on which to express the probable feelings that would rise in my heart, I would have tried to gratify her. As it was, Mrs. Forrester was the person to speak when we had recovered our composure. I don't mind among friends stating that no, I am not poor exactly, but I don't think I'm what you may call rich. I wish I were, for dear Miss Matty's sake, but, if you please, I'll write down in a sealed paper what I can give. I only wish it was more, my dear Mary, I do indeed. Now I saw why paper, pens, and ink were provided. Every lady wrote down the sum she could give annually, signed the paper, and sealed it mysteriously. If their proposal was acceded to, my father was to be allowed to open the papers under pledge of secrecy. If not, they were to be returned to their writers. When the ceremony had been gone through, I rose to depart, but each lady seemed to wish to have a private conference with me. Miss Pole kept me in the drawing-room to explain why, in Mrs. Jameson's absence, she had taken the lead in this movement, as she was pleased to call it, and also to inform me that she had heard from good sources that Mrs. Jameson was coming home directly in a state of high displeasure against her sister-in-law, who was forthwith to leave her house, and was, she believed, to return to Edinburgh that very afternoon. Of course, this piece of intelligence could not be communicated before Mrs. Fitzadam, more especially as Miss Pole was inclined to think that Lady Glenmire's engagement to Mr. Hoggins could not possibly hold against the blaze of Mrs. Jameson's displeasure. A few hearty inquiries after Miss Matty's health concluded my interview with Miss Pole. On coming downstairs, I found Mrs. Forrester awaiting me at the entrance of the dining parlour. She drew me in, and when the door was shut, she tried 2 or 3 times to begin on some subject which was so unapproachable apparently that I began to despair of our ever getting to a clear understanding. At last out it came, the poor old lady trembling all the time, as if it were a great crime which she was exposing to daylight in telling me how very, very little she had to live upon. A confession which she was brought to make from a dread lest we should think that the small contribution named in her paper bore any proportion to her love and regard for Miss Matty, and yet that sum which she so eagerly relinquished was, in truth, more than a 20th part of what she had to live upon and keep house and a little serving-maid, all as became one born a Tyrrell. And when the whole income does not nearly amount to £100, to give up a 20th of it will necessitate many careful economies, and many pieces of self-denial, small and insignificant in the world's accounts, but bearing a different value in another account-book that I have heard of. She did so wish she was rich, she said, and this wish she kept repeating with no thought of herself in it, only with a longing, yearning desire to be able to heap up Miss Matty's measure of comforts. It was some time before I could console her enough to leave her, and then, on quitting the house, I was waylaid by Mrs. Fitzadam, who had also her confidence to make of pretty nearly the opposite description. She had not liked to put down all that she could afford and was ready to give. She told me she thought she could never look Miss Matty in the face again, if she presumed to be giving her so much as she should like to do. Miss Matty, continued she, that I thought was such a fine young lady when I was nothing but a country girl, coming to market with eggs and butter and such like things. For my father, though well-to-do, would always make me go on as my mother had done before me, and I had to come into Cranford every Saturday and see after sales and prices and what not. And one day, I remember, I met Miss Matty in the lane that leads to Cumberhurst. She was walking on the footpath which, you know, is raised a good way above the road, and a gentleman rode beside her, and was talking to her, and she was looking down at some primroses she had gathered, and pulling them all to pieces, and I do believe she was crying. But after she had passed, she turned round and ran after me to ask, oh, so kindly, about my poor mother, who lay on her deathbed, and when I cried, she took hold of my hand to comfort me, and the gentleman waiting for her all the time, and her poor heart very full of something, I am sure, and I thought it such an honour to be spoken to in that pretty way by the rector's daughter who visited at Arley Hall. I have loved her ever since, though perhaps I'd no right to do it. But if you can think of any way in which I might be allowed to give a little more without anyone knowing it, I should be so much obliged to you, my dear. And my brother would be delighted to doctor her for nothing, medicines, leeches, and all. I know that he and her ladyship— my dear, I little thought in the days I was telling you of that I should ever come to be sister-in-law to a ladyship— would do anything for her. We all would. I told her I was quite sure of it, and promised all sorts of things in my anxiety to get home to Miss Matty, who might well be wondering what had become of me, absent from her 2 hours without being able to account for it. She had taken very little note of time, however, as she had been occupied in numberless little arrangements preparatory to the great step of giving up her house. It was evidently a relief to her to be doing something in the way of retrenchment, for, as she said, whenever she paused to think, the recollection of the poor fellow with his bad £5 note came over her, and she felt quite dishonest. Only, if it made her so uncomfortable, what must it not be doing to the directors of the bank, who must know so much more of the misery consequent upon this failure? She almost made me angry by dividing her sympathy between these directors, whom she imagined overwhelmed by self-reproach for the mismanagement of other people's affairs, and those who were suffering like her. Indeed, of the two, she seemed to think poverty a lighter burden than self-reproach, but I privately doubted if the directors would agree with her. Old hoards were taken out and examined as to their money value, which luckily was small, or else I don't know how Miss Matty would have prevailed upon herself to part with such things as her mother's wedding ring, the strange, uncouth brooch with which her father had disfigured his shirt-frill, etc. However, we arranged things a little in order as to their pecuniary estimation, and were all ready for my father when he came the next morning. I am not going to weary you with the details of all the business we went through, and one reason for not telling about them is that I did not understand what we were doing at the time, and cannot recollect it now. Miss Matty and I sat assenting to accounts and schemes and reports and documents, of which I do not believe we either of us understood a word, for my father was clear-headed and decisive, and a capital man of business, and if we made the slightest inquiry or expressed the slightest want of comprehension, he had a sharp way of saying, "Eh? It's as clear as daylight. What's your objection?" And as we had not comprehended anything of what he had proposed, we found it rather difficult to shape our objections. In fact, we never were sure if we had any. So presently Miss Matty got into a nervous acquiescent state, and said, "Yes, and certainly," at every pause, whether required or not. But when I once joined in as chorus to a "decidedly," pronounced by Miss Matty in a tremblingly dubious tone, my father fired round at me and asked me what there was to decide, and I am sure to this day I have never known. But in justice to him, I must say he had come over from Drumble to help Miss Matty when he could ill spare the time, and when his own affairs were in a very anxious state. while Miss Matty was out of the room giving orders for luncheon, and sadly perplexed between her desire of honouring my father by a delicate, dainty meal, and her conviction that she had no right now, that all her money was gone, to indulge this desire, I told him of the meeting of the Cranford ladies at Miss Pole's the day before. He kept brushing his hand before his eyes as I spoke, and when I went back to Martha's offer the evening before of receiving Miss Matty as a lodger, he fairly walked away from me to the window and began drumming with his fingers upon it. Then he turned abruptly round and said, "See, Mary, how a good innocent life makes friends all around. Confound it, I could make a good lesson out of it if I were a parson. But as it is, I can't get a tail to my sentences. Only I'm sure you feel what I want to say. You and I will have a walk after lunch and talk a bit more about these plans." The lunch, a hot savoury mutton chop and a little of the cold loin sliced and fried, was now brought in. Every morsel of this last dish was finished, to Martha's great gratification. Then my father bluntly told Miss Matty he wanted to talk to me alone, and that he would stroll out and see some of the old places, and then I could tell her what plan we thought desirable. Just before we went out, she called me back and said, "Remember, dear, I'm the only one left. I mean, there's no one to be hurt by what I do. I'm willing to do anything that's right and honest, and I don't think, if Deborah knows where she is, she'll care so very much if I'm not genteel, because, you see, she'll know all, dear. Only let me see what I can do and pay the poor people as far as I'm able." I gave her a hearty kiss and ran after my father. The result of our conversation was this. If all parties were agreeable, Martha and Jem were to be married with as little delay as possible, and they were to live on in Miss Matty's present abode, the sum which the Cranford ladies had agreed to contribute annually being sufficient to meet the greater part of the rent, and leaving Martha free to appropriate what Miss Matty should pay for her lodgings to any little extra comforts required. About the sale, my father was dubious at first. He said the old rectory furniture, however carefully used and reverently treated, would fetch very little, and that little would be but as a drop in the sea of the debts of the town and county bank. But when I represented how Miss Matty's tender conscience would be soothed by feeling that she had done what she could, he gave way, especially after I had told him the £5 note adventure, and he had scolded me well for allowing it. I then alluded to my idea that she might add to her small income by selling tea, and, to my surprise, for I had nearly given up the plan, my father grasped at it with all the energy of a tradesman. I think he reckoned his chickens before they were hatched, for he immediately ran up the profits of the sales that she could effect in Cranford to more than £20 a year. The small dining parlour was to be converted into a shop without any of its degrading characteristics. A table was to be the counter. One window was to be retained unaltered, and the other changed into a glass door. I evidently rose in his estimation for having made this bright suggestion. I only hoped we should not both fall in Miss Matty's. But she was patient and content with all our arrangements. She knew, she said, that we should do the best we could for her, and she only hoped, only stipulated, that she should pay every farthing that she could be said to owe for her father's sake, who had been so respected in Cranford. My father and I had agreed to say as little as possible about the bank, indeed never to mention it again, if it could be helped. Some of the plans were evidently a little perplexing to her, but she had seen me sufficiently snubbed in the morning for want of comprehension to venture on too many inquiries now, and all passed over well, with the hope on her part that no one would be hurried into marriage on her account. When we came to the proposal that she should sell tea, I could see it was rather a shock to her, not on account of any personal loss of gentility involved, but only because she distrusted her own powers of action in a new line of life, and would timidly have preferred a little more privation to any exertion for which she feared she was unfitted. However, when she saw my father was bent upon it, she sighed and said she would try, and if she did not do well, of course she might give it up. One good thing about it was she did not think men ever bought tea, and it was of men particularly she was afraid. They had such sharp, loud ways with them, and did up accounts and counted their change so quickly. Now, if she might only sell comfits to children, she was sure she could please them. End of chapter 14.
I love, at the end of this chapter, that Mary Smith says of Miss Matty that when we came to the proposal that she should sell tea, I could see it was rather a shock to her, not on account of any personal loss of gentility involved, but only because she distrusted her own powers of action in a new line of life, and would timidly have preferred a little more privation to any exertion for which she feared she was unfitted. Preferring privation to new exertion, that just made me laugh. But going back to the beginning of the chapter, I thought Martha's comment on, I don't want to listen to reason always means what someone else has got to say. It's somebody else's opinion that's not necessarily reasonable. And it's true. People are not always, when people talk about making decisions logically or reasonably, they are often not doing either. We tend to respond from emotions, whether we think we are or not. And I think it's Thinking Fast and Slow that talks about that. But I just loved Martha doing that. And then I also loved Martha coming back at Mary Smith. I'm glad you started that sentence with well, because if you'd started it with but like you did before, I wouldn't have listened to you. Ah, I love Martha. I think I told you at the beginning of the book when there wasn't a whole lot of Martha when she first showed up, there, were moments of fun, but she turns into a fabulous character, and this is that chapter. I also thought it was interesting that Mary Smith, as she's trying to go through, like, what does Miss Matty actually know? What can she do? What could she do that interacts with the world in a way where she would be paid for what she can do? I think it was very important that Mrs. Gaskell said specifically that Mary Smith is reflecting on Miss Matty's education from 50 years ago. So if it's 1840, we're talking about 1790. Where does that put us? That puts us right at the time that A Vindication on the Rights of Women was being written. And as you see in that book, Mary Wollstonecraft is very clear about how women's education most often went, and truly horrifying to think about the catch-22 that these women were in. They were being sub-educated, not educated on par with what they could handle or what they maybe needed to learn. And at the same time, people were critical of them for, like in Pride and Prejudice, trying to marry somebody who was financially stable. Talk about damned if you do and damned if you don't. There was no way out of that box. That was it. And Miss Matty falls into that squishy middle part where she isn't married, and she also now, with her loss of income, living off of the interest of their investments, she actually has no skills to fall back on. And that's a horrifying thing to think about. I know that there are many people who are going to be going through something very similar to that in the United States shortly, if not already. People who have worked a particular job or in a particular field for most of their life, and suddenly those jobs are no longer available, and there really isn't anywhere else that you could do the kind of work that you might do for the federal government. Park rangers, I'm thinking of in particular for national parks. State parks are still fine for the most part. But, also people who specialized in, Social Security Administration. Oh, if you received the email from the Social Security Administration within the last week, listening in real time in early July 2025, just know that when they're talking about tax relief, they're talking about specific income bands getting a certain percentage of relief from having Social Security stuff taxed. First off, that whole thing started in 1983. But either way, whatever the income band that you're at that may or may not give you some kind of relief on that Social Security benefit being taxed, it is temporary. It goes away, I think, in 2028. That's how the reconciliation process goes. That's what's going to happen. So it leaves us just in time for the next administration, provided there is one that comes into power. So yeah, please do your own research about the claims in that email. If you have an eye for propaganda over fact, you probably saw a whole bunch of that. I am actually working on an episode that is very specific, not about this topic, but about something with long COVID that somebody sent me that is appalling misinformation. I can't tell if it's disinformation, like they meant it to be lies and they knew it, or if they were just not particularly good at researching, but I'm going to go through that. So this has been on my radar. But back to Cranford, I also loved that Miss Matty doesn't change her handwriting when she is writing to more eminent correspondents, but instead she changes her spelling. Like, oh, if you're a highfalutin, fabulous person, I'm going to have to come up with some creative spelling for you. If it's just my friends I'm writing to, I can spell properly. I thought that was just beautiful. Oh, and I thought that throwaway at the end of the chapter of the drama between Lady Glenmire and Mrs. Jameson was tantalizing, and we hear no more about it in this chapter. So, I also thought it was lovely that you have Mrs. Forrester being horrified because she just doesn't have two mites to rub together. And so she doesn't want the small amount of her contribution to Miss Matty to be equated with her not caring. But I also loved that Mrs. Fitzadams doesn't want to give Miss Matty too much for fear that it gets back to Miss Matty somehow, because that would be an embarrassment to Miss Matty, and she doesn't want that to happen. So figuring out what the right amount to give is, it's hard triangulation, whether you're at the top of the financial pile or at the bottom. But yeah, so now you know, tea seems to be key. There will be more about that in next week's chapter. All right, I hope you enjoyed this chapter, A Friend in Need, and I hope you take care of yourself. Have a great one. I will talk to you soon. Episodes at craftlit.com. CraftLit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support CraftLit, from patreon.com/craftlit to craftlit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at craftlit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.